in a virtual learning cafe, and this is one. This is the Youth Sector Systems Guidance Virtual Learning Cafe, and we are really glad and really in a mode of celebration that after 2 years of really diligent work, we have now launched the systems guidance, thinking about the youth sector policy, and that's why you're here. And we're just very pleased to have many of you join. And just a couple of things, just housekeeping, if there's any interruptions or things happening on the Virtual Learning Cafe which aren't the usual, we'll talk about what we do then. And we just want to welcome many friends and new faces here as well, from across the youth sector system. And lastly, if you don't want to be recorded, please do just keep your camera off in that regard. So welcome, and it's really great to see you all. We'll get straight into things because we've got a tight hour, and we've got special guests too. And many of you will want to hear about what the recommendations say, and then we can come to land this morning. I hope you've got aircon where you are. I've snuck into the office, which always helps, and the aircon here is fantastic. So first of all, if you've never come across us, we are the Youth Endowment Fund, and our vision is one that's clear: a world where no child becomes involved in violence. And our mission is to find what works and to build a movement to put this knowledge into practice. And guidance building is very much at the center of that. And when it comes to the voices of young people, we've got to think about what that tells us and the experiences of young people when it comes to violence. So what we do know is, with speaking over 10,000 to 10,000 children and thinking about their experiences across England and Wales, 64 children have been murdered annually. But although homicide is moving in the right direction, by the way, it's important to also state that. 500 admitted to hospital, told us they're admitted to hospital for assault with a knife or sharp object. 1 in 20 told us they carry a knife, and this new stat, which is the one that makes your hair stand up if the rest don't already, is the fact that 1 in 10 are approached to sell, hold, or transport drugs or weapons. And that touches more young people than many may have thought that youth violence could do. And a 1 in 6 perpetrate an act of violence. 1 in 5 are victims of violence, but half our children have seen real acts of violence. Half our children have seen it. Half. I just want to really hit home with that. And therefore, half our children say that the fears of it have led to them changing their behavior, like, for example, not going to school. So violence is casting a long shadow over our children's lives. And I think that's important to stay up front, and the importance of listening to the experiences of young people. We work across all services that children and young people rely on have a role to play in keeping them safe. We work across 7 essential sectors which impact vulnerable children and young people's lives. And we are going to be publishing guidance for those sectors. So if you've been quite close to YEF, you know that yesterday there was a Children's Services conference which talked about the Children's Services practice guidance. And we're also thinking about formal education, health, neighbourhoods, policing, youth justice, and then we've got the youth sector. And the youth sector is quite distinctive in terms of its contribution to make violence prevention, to impact violence prevention, because it engages with children and young people who are vulnerable. Those who are vulnerable attend things like youth clubs at double the rate to their peers, and are likely to report to a trusted relationship with a youth worker, have a trusted relationship with a youth worker. They are also important because the universal youth services can protect children and young people from violence. And if you were closely following the practice guidance, it tells you much more about that. And also the specialist youth services can deliver effective targeted support, so especially for children who are at risk. And as someone who I had a whole life study on youth work and working with children and young people, I recognize much of this, that often you're in safe spaces with children trying to support them in a specialized way. And so this guidance focus exclusive on violence prevention, but there are many other reasons to fund youth work, and the purpose of youth work itself is not violence prevention, but the evidence is telling us it protects children and young people from violence, and it's definitely one of the benefits of youth work. In January, we published our youth sector practice guidance, which was for local commissioners and funders of youth provision across England and Wales. And this set out 8 evidence-based recommendations for what funders and commissioners can do to help prevent children and young people from becoming involved in violence. But we know that's not enough. And we know that's not enough. So commissioners are constrained by the systems that they operate in. And right now, the youth sector faces major challenges. And so funding is hugely fragmented and insecure. And some areas have much weaker provision than others. And youth workers are not always properly included in systems designed to safeguard vulnerable children and young people. I can hand on heart say that it's absolutely true just from practice. But now we're going to hear much more about that today. The Systems Guidance Report, which we published yesterday, aims to address these systemic challenges and setting out 6 key policy changes that would make it easier to deliver what works to keep children and young people safe from violence. It's important about where does the evidence come from to underpin the guidance. So one is the YEF toolkit, which is 2,000 studies, 40 different violence prevention strategies. 3 funded reviews of practice covering youth sector funding, who funds youth work and youth sector, youth clubs, and the roles of youth work and youth workers in safeguarding. So that's helping us to understand the current practice and context. And then our children, violence and vulnerability survey, which I shared some of the highlights, which surveyed over 10,000 young people and how they engage with the youth sector across England and Wales. And then the Peer Action Collective, which is the experience of young people in their own words, of youth work in their own words, and it's collected by peer researchers. And my final slide is we couldn't do this alone. And there's no way we can think about the sector without bringing brilliant minds together to really narrow down as to what's the real world change we'd like to see, based on the evidence that has come out. And we know this fantastic board of strategic advisory group leaders from across the sector have been on hand to help over the last 24 months. And it's made sure that the recommendations are feasible and relevant. And we've also worked with 15 youth sector leaders, policy experts, who are all part in academics, part of the expert panel. They've been given a detailed feedback on their entire report. So I just wanted to give the context, probably took a little bit longer than expected, but now I want to hand you over to Chloe, Chloe Lowry, who's going to talk you through the recommendations. Chloe.
Thank you so much, Caleb. So our youth sector system guidance has 6 policy recommendations, which are organised into 3 overarching themes. The first theme is reforming youth sector funding so that there's a dedicated pot of funding available for youth provision in every area and enough money to fund youth clubs as a key preventative service. The second theme is shaping the rollout of existing policy commitments. So that includes the Better Youth Spaces Fund and Young Futures Hubs, so that they better support children and young people who are vulnerable to involvement in violence. And our final theme is strengthening safeguarding, so that youth workers are properly included in the systems that are designed to safeguard the children and young people that they're supporting. Before we dive into these, I want to highlight that these recommendations are deliberately pragmatic. We're not in this report setting out to solve all of the problems and challenges facing the youth sector. Instead, what we've done here is we've focused on 6 changes that are achievable within the current policy landscape and could make a practical difference to keeping children and young people safe now. As we go through the recommendations, you'll notice that some of them apply to England only and some apply to both England and Wales. That's because youth provision is a devolved policy area, so you've got different systems in England and in Wales. Overall, you'll notice that the report contains fewer standalone recommendations for Wales, and that's just because Wales has already made a lot of progress in building the infrastructure that's needed for high-quality youth provision. But if you read the full report, you'll also see that the recommendations that are focused on England each include a What About Wales box, where we set out specific actions for the Welsh Government as well. I'll dive in to our first recommendation, which looks to tackle the core problems with youth sector funding in England. The first problem that we're trying to tackle here is that existing government funding for youth provision is fragmented and it's often short-term. One of the reviews Caleb mentioned earlier, which was published in January, found that there were over 30 different government funding streams that are used to fund youth services to varying degrees. And most of those 30 streams were less than 5 years old. When you've got this kind of fragmented funding, it's complicated, it's inefficient, and it can lead to instability for youth service providers and for the children and young people that they're supporting. The second problem is that local authority spending on youth services really varies across the country. If you look at what was spent in 2023 to 2024, the local authority that spent the most on youth services was Westminster, and they recorded a spend of £503 per child and young person. Whereas if you look at Shropshire, they recorded a spend of just £7 per child and young person. That's a 72-fold difference between those two places. And as well as just issues around fairness, the problem with this variation is that it's not linked to differences in the need for public investment in different areas. So areas with high levels of deprivation aren't more likely to receive high levels of youth services funding, and neither areas with high levels of youth offending. So there doesn't seem to be this link between spending and need. And finally, the fact that in England we don't have a dedicated funding pot for youth services means that they're really vulnerable to being crowded out by other pressures. So local authorities have strong statutory duties to be spending money on things like adult social care and children's social care. And when budgets are tight, it's natural that they cut areas where their statutory duties are weaker. For example, their statutory duty for youth services. But over time, this creates a shift from investment in preventative services to services for more acute needs. And if you look over the last 15 years, the proportion of local authorities' children's services budgets that was spent on preventative services, and that includes services for children and young people, fell from a third to just 6%. So ultimately a really small proportion being spent on prevention. So what should the government do about this? Well, there's a rare opportunity to address these issues through the live review that the Treasury is currently conducting on out-of-classroom spending for children and young people across government, which is called the Thematic Value for Money Review on Youth. And we recommend that the government takes this opportunity to bring together existing funding streams for youth services to create a single dedicated pot for youth provision. We're just calling for this in England and not in Wales because Wales already has a dedicated pot for youth provision. What we're saying here is that this pot should be distributed to local authorities using a needs formula, so that areas with more children and young people and areas with more vulnerable children and young people end up receiving more funding. Local authorities would then have freedom to choose what youth services they spend it on, from open access youth work, targeted youth work, mentoring, holiday activities, school enrichment, sports, social action, etc. The additional cost to central government over what they're already planning would actually be nothing. What we're asking for here isn't more money. We will talk about that in the next recommendation. But here it's just for the existing money to be spent more efficiently and fairly, so that children who are vulnerable can benefit from stable and sustainable youth services in their area. So that's recommendation 1. Our second recommendation, sticking on this theme of reforming funding, addresses the problem of funding for youth clubs across both England and Wales. The problem is that the local authority spending on youth services has fallen by 3/4 in England and over 1/4 in Wales since 2010. I know these diagrams are a bit small, but you can see on the left there's funding for youth services in England in real terms over the last 15 years. And then on the right, you have the same for youth services in Wales. And they're a bit small, but you can see that overall downward trend. And funding for open access provision has been particularly affected. A report for the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in England found that between 2014 and 2021, local authority funding for targeted services was reduced. It was reduced by 1/3, but funding for open access services was reduced by 1/2. So cuts have particularly fallen on open access services like youth clubs. And now 1 in 12 local authorities report that there are no youth centres in their area whatsoever, whether run by themselves or others. And this is concerning for a lot of reasons. One of those reasons is that youth clubs reach children and young people who are vulnerable to involvement in violence, as my colleague Caleb was talking about. In our survey of 10,000 13 to 17-year-olds, we found that children who are vulnerable to involvement in violence are much more likely to attend a youth club. So 65% of children and young people who'd perpetrated violence in the last year attend a youth club, compared to just 35% of those who hadn't perpetrated violence. It's really important to note that these figures are about who youth clubs are reaching, not about the impact they have on the children and young people who attend them. We'll talk about that impact in a moment. But it's encouraging because it suggests that youth clubs are engaging children and young people who are really in need of support. I also wanted to highlight a finding from this survey, which is that youth clubs are particularly well attended by children and young people from Black, Asian and other minority ethnic backgrounds. So, for example, 64% of Black children and young people said they regularly attended a youth club, compared to just 36% of white children and young people. And 3 of the 6 recommendations in this guidance focus on youth clubs or youth hubs in some way. And we expect that implementing those recommendations will particularly benefit children and young people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And that can help to reduce the racial disproportionality that we see in who is affected by violence. Finally, there's evidence that youth club closures that we've been talking about actually increased crime and violence among children and young people. So a study of youth club closures across London found that in areas where all youth clubs closed, youth offending increased. Children and young people in those affected areas became 14% more likely to commit crimes, and they performed slightly worse in their GCSEs than their peers. This study is fascinating, but it's also limited because it just looked at London, and we're actually funding the author of that study to extend her work to look at the impact of youth club closures across the whole of England and Wales. The recommendation I'm about to talk about, recommendation 2, is conditional on the findings of this study. If the study were to find that the impact extends beyond London, this would provide a really clear and urgent justification for the governments in England and Wales to invest in youth clubs. So, subject to the study findings, we're calling on the English and Welsh governments to introduce new dedicated funding for youth clubs as a key preventative service. This would mean new multi-year revenue funding to cover the costs of running youth clubs on an ongoing basis. This could be for youth clubs in youth centres, in community centres, in schools, in religious organisations, and it could be either commissioned out or delivered directly by local authorities. This recommendation applies across both England and Wales. If you look at youth club closures in England and Wales, the number of local authority-run youth club centres has fallen by 60% in England and by 60% in Wales. So this is a really urgent need in both nations. Unusually for our system guidance reports, we're not setting out a costing for this recommendation at this stage, because it really does depend on the study findings that we're expecting in spring next year. What we're doing instead is we're encouraging the government to use the evaluation findings to inform a cost-benefit analysis that then they can use to guide decisions on how much money to invest in this. At this stage, we really don't know what this new study will find, but the study of London found that closing youth clubs wasn't cost effective. For every £1 that was saved from closing the youth clubs, there were losses of nearly £3 due to increased crime cost and reduced educational attainment. So depending on the study findings, the economic case for investment may make itself. I'm going to pause there and hand back to my colleague Caleb for a moment to introduce our fantastic guest speaker.
Thanks, Chloe, and way to kick us off. So we want to introduce and bring on to speak to this recommendation Luke Billingham, who is a youth worker at Hackney Quest and a research associate at the Open University. At Hackney Quest, Luke's youth work role involves both one-to-one support of young people experiencing difficulties and co-developing a range of neighbourhood projects in Hackney Wick, where Luke is from. At the Open University, his role focuses on research impact, particularly drawing on the ESRC funding, which is a public health, youth and violence reduction research project, a multi-university study which investigated violence reduction in Scotland and England. He has co-authored 3 books about violence affecting young people and violence reduction policy making. Luke, over to you. Thank you.
Cheers, Caleb. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you perfectly.
Excellent. Being audible is a good start. Morning all, and thanks for involving me in this, Caleb and Chloe. And I'm glad to be offering a very brief bit of input to back up recommendation 2. I think there are lots of reasons to back this recommendation from my personal perspective, and I'll emphasize that personal perspective bit in terms of everything that I'm about to say. I think it's obvious that in 21st century Britain, every community in our country should have a thriving ecosystem of youth provision to support the flourishing of children and young people, to serve their diverse interests and needs in every local youth population. I think that doesn't only mean youth clubs, in my view. I think every community should have a range of provision: formal and informal play provision, detached youth work, high quality sports provision, youth work in schools, digital youth work, and so on. And I think every part of our country should be imbued with a culture of hospitality, warmth, care, and embrace towards children and young people. And I feel we're far from that. I think some aspects of our culture are imbued with ephibophobia, which is the technical term for irrational fear of teenagers. But within that broader ecosystem, I think youth clubs can play an especially important role for young people as a core public service, as social infrastructure for young people. And using the language, I think, of core public service is important, because when we talk about something as a core public service, I think that means two things. Firstly, that it has inherent intrinsic value as a feature of a good society. And secondly, that it can have extrinsic measurable benefits to children and young people and to society. And I'll say a word about each of those. Firstly, on the intrinsic point, I think children and young people having access to social infrastructure, to recreation, informal education, personal development, relational support should be seen as an inherently important part of what it is to be a good society. I then think it's necessary in terms of non-negotiable children's rights. We should still maximize the quality. We should still assess what those facilities are doing, but I don't think it should be optional. I don't think personally it should be seen as conditional or contingent. But secondly, we know that youth clubs can make a huge difference. They can support a raft of outcomes, both in relation to children and young people and wider society, in terms of well-being, in terms of safety, development, flourishing, and as Chloe alluded to, there's a strong economic case as well. I think youth clubs are especially valuable when they're deeply embedded, when they're trusted parts of the furniture of local communities, of local neighborhoods, when they're both an excellent place in terms of being a high quality facility and staffed by excellent people who are skilled, trained, well supported, and who embody a love of their community and a love of children and young people. I think that kind of place and those kind of people is what every child and young person in every community deserves and should be seen as entitled to. I think they should be seen both as a mark of a good society and something which can serve a raft of positive outcomes, ranging from young people's safety, including young people's safety, community peacefulness, and violence reduction. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Luke. And it's really important to the bit that you just posed on at the end there about the violence reduction as a result of all these things, not that being the lead, and well said. Society should offer better child-focused, opportunity galvanizing, connected to its local people, youth clubs that have high quality in every community as a child right and a basic entitlement. So thank you, Luke, powerfully said, and I really appreciate it. And great to have you welcome. I was looking at when was your last one with us, and a couple of years ago. So always good to have you back. So I'm going to hand you back over to Chloe, who's going to run us through the rest of the recommendations before we come to some Q&A. Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you so much, Luke. And it's fantastic to hear you talk more broadly about the benefits of youth clubs for young people in society and their place in society. As we said at the beginning, we've got this mission focused on violence prevention, but a lot of what we're talking about today is key to young people for a wide range of reasons beyond their physical safety. We're going to continue actually the youth club theme as we move in to think about the second theme that we're talking about, which is shaping the rollout of existing policy commitments. And recommendation 3 continues this theme of focus on youth clubs. with a focus on how the Better Youth Spaces Fund can be spent to support the most vulnerable children and young people. The study of London youth clubs that I mentioned earlier shows us the importance of youth clubs' locations. It found that the increase in youth offending which occurred when a youth club closed was offset if there was another youth club in the area. And this effect wasn't found when they looked at local parks or sports centres or libraries, which is really interesting and suggests that youth centres are having a unique contribution here that can't be replaced by other types of support. The author conducted a what-if analysis, which suggested that the crime increases that we saw when youth club closures happened could have been almost completely avoided if the decision makers had been prioritising children and young people's access to at least one local club when they decided which clubs to close. So the effect is not simply about the number of youth clubs available to young people, it's also about how those youth clubs are distributed. And the most efficient distribution of youth clubs is the one that minimises the number of areas without any youth clubs, which we could call youth club deserts. And those deserts are a problem because they put children and young people at risk of involvement in violence and crime, as well as being a problem for the wider reasons which Luke spoke so eloquently about. That's why we're calling on the government to target funding to address those youth club deserts, and particularly to address them in areas where there are high levels of violence and crime amongst young people. The government's already committed £350 million to the Better Youth Spaces Fund, which has the goal of refurbishing and rebuilding youth clubs and youth facilities. We're calling for that money to be spent in the areas that need it most. Because this Better Youth Spaces Fund is a policy in England, this recommendation focuses on England. But if you read the report, you'll see that we do ask Welsh Government to consider funding an equivalent capital building programme to improve youth club access in Wales. And if you look at recommendation 2 and recommendation 3 next to each other, you'll see that in recommendation 2, we're calling for that funding for ongoing revenue costs. So mostly that's going to be staffing costs. And here we're also thinking about actually youth club buildings. And those both of those elements are really key. For this recommendation, there's zero additional cost to central government from implementing it, because it's about using that money that's already been committed, but spending it in the way that focuses on young people who currently really lack access to provision and are the most vulnerable. In recommendation 4, we focus on ensuring that young futures hubs are grounded in the best available evidence of what works. So young futures hubs, if you're not familiar with the government policy, are quite new, locally designed open access spaces intended to serve 10 to 18-year-olds. And they all have 3 goals, which is supporting access to job opportunities, improving mental health, and reducing vulnerability to being drawn into crime. And the government's committed to opening 50 of these hubs over the next 4 years in high violence areas. The challenge here is that, at least when it comes to that goal of preventing crime and preventing knife crime, it would be easy for young futures hubs to adopt approaches that aren't based in evidence. And there are a number of quite common violence prevention strategies that at the moment we don't have any evidence that they work. So, for example, most youth clubs say that they offer knife crime awareness activities, even though there's no robust evidence that these kinds of activities actually reduce violence. And I'm sure that across youth clubs there are different types of activities in place that might fall under that banner, but there is a risk that some sessions, depending on what they involve, could backfire. So, for example, if a session ends up making young people more worried about knife-related violence, that could encourage them to carry knives for self-protection. We know from our Children Violence Vulnerability Survey that half of young people who carry knives do so because they feel it will protect themselves. By contrast, there are some approaches that have been studied and found to be effective at preventing violence and crime amongst children and young people. So things like sports programmes, mentoring, youth clubs, and cognitive behavioural therapy. But it's not just about what types of support the hubs offer, it's also about delivering that support well. So staff will need training, confidence and support to be able to identify need, to build trusted relationships with children and young people who might be really vulnerable, and to deliver these different types of evidence-informed support well. There are also the wider conditions that are needed for high quality delivery. So things like having stable staffing, things like staff development, continuity of relationships, and having effective links with local safeguarding systems, which we'll come to talk about a bit more in our final theme. So that's why we're calling for the Department for Culture, Media and Sport to ensure that the guidance that it's developing for local areas on Young Futures hubs is grounded in evidence of what works. The good news here is that, at least for the goal of violence and crime prevention, we've already done a lot of the work of bringing that evidence together into actionable recommendations for youth provision. You might be familiar with our youth sector practice guidance, which we published in January, which does just that. If you haven't seen it, I'd really encourage you to go and have a look at it. We have 8 recommendations in that report, which cover 3 themes: getting the right focus on vulnerable children and young people, offering approaches that work to prevent crime and violence, and establishing strong foundations for high quality youth provision. So all of this content is already there, and we're encouraging the government to draw content from this practice guidance so that local authorities who are setting up Young Futures hubs for the first time have access to the best available evidence when they're making their decisions. We're also encouraging the government to ensure that the hubs can offer mental health support to children who are at risk of or involved in violence, not just children and young people struggling with challenging issues like anxiety and depression. And this is because we know that approaches like cognitive behavioural therapy and trauma-specific therapies can help reduce children and young people's vulnerability to violence, as well as improving their mental health. So offering this mental health support through the hubs is really key. One of the goals is already to improve mental health, and we're encouraging the government to ensure that includes children who are vulnerable to involvement in violence and crime. This is also potentially really key for children and young people from Black and Asian backgrounds. Children from Black and Asian backgrounds are less likely to be referred to mental health support currently. But we do know, as we've spoken about earlier, that they're more likely to attend youth clubs. So the hubs could be a key way of reaching them with support if they're able to offer it well. As with the Better Youth Spaces Fund, this is an England-only policy, so the recommendation only applies to England. But we do encourage the Welsh Government to make use of this evidence by integrating it into the supporting materials for local youth work planning in Wales. And as before, this recommendation is 0 additional cost to central government because the guidance is already being developed. This brings us on to our final theme, which is strengthening safeguarding. And we start here by focusing on the training that youth workers need to support vulnerable children and young people. It's really encouraging that the UK government's plan to halve knife crime and its violence against women strategy have both committed to strengthening the training that youth workers receive in safeguarding children and young people from violence. But we're aware this is a challenging thing to do well. So here we highlight the key challenges that any training must address, and then propose a way of taking that forward that addresses these challenges. The first challenge is that children and young people who youth workers support often experience different and overlapping forms of violence. So, for example, in that survey of 10,000 13 to 17-year-olds, nearly half of the teenagers who said they were in they'd been in a romantic relationship in the last year, said that they'd either experienced or perpetrated some kind of relationship abuse, whether emotional or physical, within the last year. So relationship abuse is worryingly common amongst the age group that youth workers are working with. But when you look at children, young people who are involved in serious violence, it's even more common. The survey found that amongst teenagers who were in relationships, nearly 3/4 of those who perpetrated serious violence had also committed relationship abuse. So you've got these different and often overlapping forms of violence that youth workers need to be able to understand and safeguard children from. The other challenge here is that to support children and young people who are affected by violence, youth workers often have to navigate really complex local system responses to that violence or wider harm outside the home. We funded a review of youth work that Caleb mentioned earlier, a review of youth workers' role in safeguarding, which found that youth workers can easily end up being drawn into inappropriate roles. So things like crime reduction practices, like dispersing young people from an area, or mapping peer groups for the sake of policing. And the review concluded that actually existing safeguarding training for youth workers really doesn't equip them to interact with these really complex systems. So you've got a kind of insufficiency of current training and that need to understand system responses, as well as understanding the various harms affecting young people. So we're calling on the Department for Culture and Media and Sport in England and the Welsh Government to fund training that prepares youth workers to respond to the range of violence involving children and young people, and to work alongside partner agencies like the police and children's social care in an appropriate way. In the guidance, we suggest a three-tier training approach, starting with, in Tier 1, universal safeguarding basics for all staff and volunteers who are involved in delivering youth services. Then Tier 2, core youth practitioner skills. That's for the professionals who regularly support children and young people. And then 3, specialist high-risk practice. And that would be for specialist practitioners who routinely support children and young people who are affected by harm outside the home. And in the guidance, we set out suggested training content for each level, covering violence, including violence against women and girls, relationship abuse, and child criminal exploitation, alongside helping youth workers to understand those local pathways and partnership responses to the harm that children and young people may experience outside the home and what their role in those are. Critically, we're calling on the government to ensure that any training is developed through a co-production process involving key stakeholders within the youth sector and within children's social care, and of course, children and young people who've experienced these harms themselves. This recommendation should be implemented across England and Wales. And once again, the cost to government for implementing it would be nothing, because they've already committed to training reforms. Building on this theme, recommendation 6 focuses on strengthening youth workers' role in responses to harm outside the home, sometimes called extrafamilial harm, by updating statutory safeguarding guidance. The problem with the current setup is that youth workers can be left out of multi-agency responses to extrafamilial harm, even when that affects the children and young people that they're supporting. And often it might be the youth worker who has the strongest relationship with the child and young person in question. The review of youth workers' role in safeguarding that we've been talking about found that youth workers are playing a frontline role in safeguarding children from harm outside the home. But at the same time, they're often, or too often, being left out of the system responses that are designed to protect children from that harm. So 1 in 8 local authorities reported that youth workers' involvement in formal safeguarding systems in their area was rare or non-existent. And the researchers found that even when youth workers were involved in multi-agency responses, their contributions could end up being marginalised. So as part of the researchers sat in on multi-agency meetings, and they saw examples where youth workers were in attendance, but they didn't say very much, or they did speak, but they weren't listened to, or they did speak and they were actively contradicted. And that was particularly common from police or social care representatives. So that's a key problem we're trying to tackle here. And I've got a quote here that I thought just captured this quite well, from a youth worker who said this: "I've been in multi-agency meetings before, and the social worker that's leading the meeting just reads out all of my notes about a particular child to the group, rather than saying, oh, I'm not the best person to answer, and call on me, who's been seeing that young person 3 times a week, to lead the discussion." And I wanted to share that with you today, because I think that just really captures the way in which youth workers, despite sometimes having those really strong relationships with children and young people, can be marginalised within the processes designed to support those children and young people and keep them safe. The challenge here is compounded by the fact that existing safeguarding guidance doesn't actually set out how local safeguarding partnerships or regional safeguarding boards should be involving youth workers in multi-agency responses. So in both English safeguarding guidance and Welsh safeguarding guidance, the role of youth work providers isn't clearly defined. And this is a contrast to education settings, which have their own dedicated statutory guidance. Youth work providers don't have that, so they don't have something that really digs into and explains their role. And this is a key gap, because involving youth workers in statutory safeguarding responses is something that's quite complicated. Unlike various statutory service, youth work relies completely upon the voluntary relationship between the child and the youth worker. The child doesn't have to turn up and engage in youth work if they don't want to, in contrast to, for example, education settings. And so that trust that the youth worker builds with the child or young person they support is really key. And it can create tensions when a youth worker then interacts with a statutory system, which isn't always consent-based. And when you don't have clear guidance on how youth workers should interact with these systems, this can on the one hand lead to youth workers being left out and not involved, or it can lead to them being asked to contribute in ways that are not appropriate to their role, and can even undermine those trusting relationships that are so key to their work. And I wanted to share one more quote with you from a focus group participant in the research who talked about this issue. They said this: previously at multi-agency safeguarding panels, I think there was an attitude of, you need to go and find out who's who and where they're spending time and who they're with, and put it as intel. That's intelligence. I've had previous examples of young people then being told, oh, your youth worker said she saw you with X, Y, and Z. And then that completely ruins your relationship with that young person. So that's the challenge that we're trying to address in recommendation 6. And we're calling on both England and Wales to update their statutory safeguarding guidance to strengthen youth workers' role in responses to extrafamilial harm, which is harm outside the home. We're advising that the new guidance should be, or the updated guidance, should be developed through a co-production process involving key stakeholders. And we outline changes in our report that should be considered for including in the revised guidance. So this includes having a presumption that youth workers or other trained youth practitioners should be invited to contribute to multi-agency responses where they have an established relationship with a child or young person in question. Now, the youth worker or youth practitioner might make the decision that it's best not to engage in that instance. They'll use their professional judgment, but that invitation should be made so that they have that opportunity. We're also calling for them to consider ensuring that senior youth work representation is present in strategic discussions about extrafamilial harm. And also we're calling for them to consider setting principles for multi-agency work that can protect youth workers' distinct role and the consent-based relationships they have with young people. These changes to guidance obviously then need to be embedded, so we suggest ways of doing this, for example, through training and updates to inspection frameworks. The guidance should be updated in both England and Wales. And because this can happen through scheduled updates to existing guidance, again, there's no additional cost to central government. So we've run through a lot in the last 45 minutes or so. We've covered 6 key policy changes that we're calling on policymakers in England and Wales to make to prevent children and young people from becoming involved in violence. We started by thinking about the funding of the sector and how that funding should be reformed. Firstly, so that there's a dedicated pot of funding available for youth provision in every area, particularly with more money in areas with more young people and more vulnerable young people. We covered ensuring that there's enough money to fund youth clubs as a key preventative service. Then within our second theme, shaping the rollout of existing policies, we covered the Better Youth Spaces Fund and how that should be used to open new youth clubs in areas where existing provision is weakest and violence vulnerability is highest. And then the Young Futures Hubs guidance, calling for the Young Futures Hubs guidance to incorporate evidence on what works. And then finally, strengthening safeguarding, so that youth workers are properly equipped to respond to the range of violence involving young people and equipped to work effectively with partner agencies. and then calling for that update to statutory guidance that we've just been talking about, so that their role throughout responses to extrafamilial harm is strengthened. There is a lot more detail and evidence included in the guidance report itself. I haven't had the time to talk about everything today, but I'd really encourage you, if you're interested, to go to our website and to download the full report. Thank you so much for your time and attention on this rather hot morning. It's brilliant to have so many people with us today. We've now got some time for a Q&A, so I'll hand back to Caleb to lead on that. Thank you.
Brilliant, Chloe, thanks for taking us on that stellar ride through the policy recommendations here. And for colleagues, again, just to really neatly tie this together, the systems guidance is born out of the practice guidance, and the two work together in tandem at the system level and at the practice level around commissioners and funders, and now policy leaders. In terms of questions, we've got a few questions, and we'll get through that. And it looks like I believe when you go to download, you have to input some information, and off the back of that, then you can download it. But if you're having any issues with that, please just email us, and then we'll see what we can do from there. There's a couple of questions in the chat, so let's try and tackle those first, and then we'll roll out. It's from John. It says, I think regarding recommendation 1, is it related to the 1,000 per 1,000 of population or absolute numbers?
Yeah, great question, John. In the detail of the report, we talk about a funding formula that could be used to allocate funding to local authorities. And one of the key elements of that formula would just be the number of children and people in an area. Obviously, the different areas of the country have different numbers of children and young people. So it would be key, absolutely, that funding is weighted towards areas where there are more children and young people. I hope that answers your question, but please do follow up if not.
Yeah, super. Thank you, Chloe. Yes, the slides will be available post the session. That's wonderful. Some like in some context experience of the qualified youth club versus the youth workers and versus the unqualified, and what it meant in terms of reduction in ASB around those two places. Mushtaq, sorry you got kicked out. No idea why that happens. The gremlins are against us at times. Judy's question was about, when we refer to youth clubs, does this include, and welcome Judy by the way, include safe spaces, which for some young people is a requirement more so than a traditional youth club? And Jane put like libraries, like different environments, hosting that as if it's youth worker involved, and then it will have the similar effects to youth club. But did we pick anything in our research about the context of where the youth club was?
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. We are in our recommendation 2 focusing on youth clubs specifically, because the study that I mentioned about youth club closures in London was looking at youth clubs specifically rather than other types of support. And it found that when youth club closures happened, when a youth club closed, having a local library there or a local park or a local sports centre didn't mitigate that effect of that closure, whereas having another local youth club did. So that would suggest that there's something really key going on around youth clubs and their support they're providing for children and young people. But we are emphasising that youth clubs can look quite different. You can have youth clubs in schools, you can have youth clubs in religious organisations. And we know from our children violence vulnerability data, that survey that we've talked about quite a few times, that children who are vulnerable to involvement in violence attend all of these types of youth clubs in quite high proportions. So that's why we're encouraging the government to invest in all of these types. In terms of the location of youth clubs, the study defined a local area as being a 30-minute walk from the youth club. So sometimes we talk about a 40-minute walk as being the kind of definition of a youth club desert. But obviously in rural areas, that's going to look quite different. And one of the things that we're quite excited about the study that we're funding at the moment is it will allow us to see what's going on in with youth clubs in rural areas. And what the definition of a youth club does it in a rural area might look like, as opposed to an urban area like London.
Yeah, thank you. And I've got one more here, Chloe, if you don't mind, about when we talk about the evidence of providing provision where it's weakest. Anthony's asked about how this is assessed, and so maybe let's just draw on Carmen's study and the studies are available to us about how different youth provision was picked up, youth clubs predominantly were picked up, and then maybe I can talk about recommendation 1 in the practice guidance about how to do that in a local context.
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. It's a great question around how do you know where provision is strongest and weakest? And this was one of the challenges actually in making this recommendation. There's not a single source where which you can look at and say, okay, well, these are the areas with the highest levels of need. Instead, there's a kind of patchwork of a few different sources that in the guidance we encourage areas to draw on. So just trying to pull it up at the moment. Things like the NYA census, which shows the locations of different youth services across the country, but we know that doesn't capture all areas and all services for children and young people. There's also things like UK Youth has a map of all of the organisations in their network that we share a link to. There's 360 Giving has a database of charitable grants from funders, so you can see where some of the money for youth funding is going, and that gives you kind of a sense of where provision is. And recently, the Social Investment Business and University of Leeds published a dashboard looking at youth provision across England, which used data from the charity commissions, so looking at where youth services were registered. So although there's not a single source, kind of single authoritative source, there are different sources out there that we're encouraging areas to use and government to use to identify what are those highest need areas, where is provision weakest currently. But it's a challenge, this sort of understanding where youth provision is.
Yeah, and just to add my two comments here. One is under the reform and funding recommendation 1, that thematic element and a single pot based on some criteria is actually quite important, whether you rural, for example, rural or not. And number 2, I think more important is that we're the expert in evidence, but you're the expert in your context. And so we're giving you the things that you should think about based on the evidence that we found to help you better map out what's happening locally. And we've not even started to talk about what is the PCC got in their budget and where is that going. Like, there's quite a bit of work, and being transparent with you, the work that you did up to the end of the last month, which is June, is completely different in July, because funding does come and go quite quickly. So there's something about what is the best way to keep on top of that, and there's some work that we're doing to think through how we might do that. And on the Chris, on the question about other professionals, yeah, the youth hubs will have other professionals in there, but I think you can use please use lobby this with these recommendations to shout about what the youth sector's role is in those national programs and local programs. And so what you want to be saying is well qualified, well trained, well resourced youth workers can make a difference if you take an evidence-based approach. And the evidence that we link to and that youth hub should be delivering should involve the youth sector. So there's kind of no getting away from it, even if there are other professions. You're going to need other professions just because of the way the youth hubs are set up. Let me scroll down a little bit. We've got 5 minutes left. Whilst I'm scrolling down, please raise your hand if you, and then we need a bit of time to give you a permission to speak, but please raise your hand if you've got like a burning question. But whilst we're in the intermediary of that, wanted to just let you know that on the 22nd of September, 10 to 11, we have part 3 of a 3-part series to do with the youth sector practice guidance. If you missed the first 2, where have you been? But at the same time, there will be recordings you can go back, and we really go into depth to what is in the guidance. Again, we've put the guidance in the chat, both the practice guidance and the systems guidance. And if you want to talk about anything we've said today, please reach out. We're very keen to listen to policy commissioners, and have discussions with our policy colleagues as well about what's the way that we can mobilize on that. And we're thinking hard to do that. And then finally, there will be in the chat, and there's lots of chat which we love. There will be in the chat a feedback form. So if you've got any feedback, please let us know, because we're always trying to improve these sessions as a whole. And for those of you who are commissioners here, we have a self-assessment coming out soon. We're really looking forward to that. And if you're very interested in that, there's also another link that Yanina will share to just register your interest. But we will blanket come out to everybody to say, if you're a commissioner in your local context, here is a self-assessment tool which then helps to get on along the journey. But today's about the systems guidance and our policy colleague and what they can help you do. Any questions? I'll pause for another few seconds. Yes, the recording will be available, and yeah, there'll be a newsletter for colleagues. And again, look, you are the context expert. We're the evidence experts. Together, I think we can do a lot. So that's the thing I want you to keep in mind, because I think this is something that the sector's never had before, and together we can make things happen. It's part of the reason why I joined YEF, if I'm all honest with you, just to give a bit. Andrew, you look like you had a question there, or maybe you're doing heart signs. Lots of heart signs. Yes, we really appreciate that. But I think maybe because there isn't a question, we'll end there and give you 3 minutes for your coffee before the next meeting. So a huge thank you to Luke. Luke, thanks for coming along. Really great to have you speak passionately about youth clubs. Chloe, thank you so much. Been working quite closely with Chloe over the last 24 months. This is quite an exciting piece, a huge milestone. And if I wasn't so warm, I'd probably shed a tear. And then thanks, Yanina, for helping us over the last couple of years in terms of putting this together. More to come. This is just the beginning. So appreciate it. Have a good day, and see you at the next one. Take care now. Oh, Martin, go ahead. You've got like 3 minutes. Everyone's leaving, but let's go. Oh no, is it gone? It's gone now. Martin, you want to? Let's do Martin if we can. Yanina, if it's possible. No, or maybe he was just doing the thank you, clapping, and raised his hand. Brilliant. Luke, superb, superstar. We'll catch you later, all right?
Cheers. See you soon.
Thank you.